It is a conflict that has caused the worst humanitarian disaster in modern times. And 3 years on from the uprising against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, there is still no end in sight to the suffering. So what can be done to break the deadlock? Hello, I'm Jane Dutton, and this is Inside Syria. In the words of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Syria is now the biggest humanitarian and peace and security crisis facing the world, with violence reaching unthinkable levels. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs says more than 2.5 million Syrians have fled abroad and another 6.5 million have been displaced within Syria. That's 40% of the population in need of humanitarian aid. And more people are dying every day. The death toll now is said to be at least 140,000. Nazreen El-Shamaya reports from Lebanon's Bekaa Valley.
Insaf Khalid, a Syrian refugee from Idlib, never thought she'd give birth to her youngest child in Lebanon. Hala, only a week old, is one of Lebanon's newest Syrian refugees. Her parents and siblings became refugees here, but she was brought into this world as one.
I feel sorry for her because whatever she'll have, it'll be less than what her siblings had. She'll be deprived when it comes to clothes, heat, a warm bed and basic health care.
With the war in Syria completing its third year, the refugees who have been in exile the longest are the most pessimistic. Awad al-Hamad and his family have been living in a tented community in the Bekaa Valley for over a year and a half.
The war has prevented us from having any dreams or plans for our lives. We just survived the day, not knowing what will happen to us tomorrow. All our hopes and ambitions and plans have been shattered because of this war. We have no hope for the future.
His son tells him he wants to return to Syria because he's unhappy here. But Awad says they can't return because Syria is too dangerous. Over 2.5 million Syrians have been registered as refugees in neighboring countries. The majority are here in Lebanon. 3 years after the start of the conflict and with no political solution, the future looks even more uncertain for these people. The UN Refugee Agency says Syrians could make up the largest refugee population in the world. The war has devastated children the most. Between those living under siege in Syria, those displaced internally, and those living in exile, 5.5 million Syrian children are affected. Despite the conditions they face in exile, Syrians are still fleeing, choosing a life of hardship over death. Iman Ibrahim and her family recently fled from Idlib. They've only been here for 10 days, and all they feel is fear and uncertainty.
We're afraid we'll never be able to go back. We're also afraid our house will be destroyed and things will get so much worse than they already are. We'll never be able to go back.
The war is causing a humanitarian catastrophe. It's one that continues to grow. And if the world fails to act, refugees say they not only feel abandoned, but deprived of a future. Nazreen El-Shamaya, Al Jazeera, Bekaa Valley, Lebanon.
So let's bring in our guests. In New York, Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. From Beirut, we have Elias Hanna, a retired Lebanese Army general and military analyst. And also joining us from New York is Bruce Jones, Director of the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Kenneth Roth, let me start off with you. Update us on the humanitarian situation, which just seems to be getting worse.
Well, it does. You just focused on the refugees. And of course, the reason there are 2.5 million registered refugees is that life is so horrible within Syria. What makes this war different from so many others is that this is not a war in which combatants are shooting at combatants. Rather, the Syrian government's strategy is to make life as miserable as possible for the civilians who happen to live in opposition-held areas. That means indiscriminately bombing them and shelling them, including with these barrel bombs. It means besieging cities and depriving them of humanitarian assistance. To this day, not allowing the cross-border humanitarian assistance, even though the UN Security Council ordered it to allow that cross-border aid 3 weeks ago. So that is the horrible situation that remains inside Syria. That's why so many people are displaced within the country and why so many are being forced to flee outside of the country.
And we now know that something like 10,000 children have died in this war. I mean, they are the real victims here, aren't they? Because those who survive will have this psychological trauma for the rest of their lives?
Well, part of Assad's strategy is to target schools, to target hospitals, to target the ordinary institutions that make life livable for people in opposition-held areas. And obviously the children suffer enormously. They've suffered a polio outbreak that's a product of the fact that the Assad government has blocked vaccination efforts in many of the opposition-held areas. They're suffering a lack of schooling because so many of their schools have been destroyed, and the receiving countries, while being very generous in allowing refugees in, have not been able to replace the educational system that existed in Syria. So we're seeing horrible consequences really for people of all ages. This is a war on civilians, but as you point out, children are suffering enormously.
Elias Hanna, what do you make of the military strategy as far as the humanitarian situation is concerned?
I think regardless of the humanitarian catastrophe in Syria, from a military point of view, it seems that the regime plus Hezbollah plus the backing of Iran are making a lot of progress. So far, everybody was talking like 3 years ago that the regime won't hold for like more than 3 to 4 months. All of a sudden, we are in the 3rd year. The regime is really controlling the main areas, the coastal areas, including the side in Lebanon or inside of Lebanon. Moreover, is holding and maybe is preparing to go for the next election of the presidential. So I think that the political issue is totally depending on what's going to happen on the ground. From the tactical level to the strategic level, then you go, unless there is like stalemate for a long period of time where everybody is fatigued, everybody is attrited, or the political solution is imposed by the great powers, especially the United States of America or Russia. Now we are seeing what's going on. They are joking in Ukraine. So what's happening maybe in Ukraine will really complicate more and more the situation in Syria, at least at the political level.
Do you think this position of power that Assad is now in impacts on the humanitarian crisis in the sense that the military, for example, is still loyal to him? They could, if they wanted to, open up more human corridors, couldn't they? So that aid could get in and out of besieged areas.
I think that the regime is fighting for its survival, and they will do whatever it takes to hold and stay forever. You know what I mean? As far as the forces that are fighting with the Assad, you have Hezbollah, you have the regime forces, and some backing from Iraq or from Iran. They are loyal, and they are highly cohesive, and they are fighting for their survival. I mean, this is the question, me or you. It's like zero-sum game. So that's why maybe the humanitarian issue is main consequence for what is happening. This brutality, you know what I mean? So maybe we are seeing like continuous humanitarian issue. When you see the 2.5, your guest in Washington said 2.5 registered. I mean, what about the non-registered and the way they live? I mean, the way they live in Lebanon. I've seen a lot of them, and they are around. They are, you know, all over the street in Lebanon now, begging for money, begging for food, whatever. So the question, the humanitarian question will be for a longer period of time, more than 5 years, I guess. More than 5 years.
Let me bring in Bruce Jones now. What do you make of the humanitarian situation and how it is being exploited by the perpetrators, by those still fighting?
It's an extremely serious humanitarian crisis, as Ken said, both if you look at the numbers of refugees outside the country, but also the atrocious situation inside the country and the deliberate targeting of civilians and using really despicable techniques by the regime. And it seems to me that until the situation changes on the ground militarily, we're not likely to see any change in the regime's tactics.
You do wonder how many people have to die, what a sort of acceptable level is before something serious is done to put a stop to this.
It's an appalling situation, and it's been an enduring situation. If we are absolutely frank about it, there have been many civil wars in which far more people have died than in this, and so unfortunately it could well be the case that we see this endure. In fact, I think that unless there's a serious change in American policy in particular, we will see this endure, and we will see the numbers continue to grow. The one point that I would make, which is slightly different from your previous speaker, is it does seem to me that the situation in Ukraine may have the opposite effect than was suggested. In other words, to the extent that the administration had any remaining shred of hope that it was feasible to negotiate a political solution to the Syrian crisis with the Russians, I think the Ukraine crisis will put paid to that. I haven't believed that for more than a year and a half, but there are those within the administration, including the president, who clearly have held out hope for negotiations with the Russians, and I think the Ukraine crisis will put paid to that, and that may cause some rethinking in the American position.
Bruce, you've got a new book coming out called Still Ours to Lead, America, Rising Powers and the Tension Between Rivalry and Restraint. And in that you say that Syria has become a kind of perverse poster child for deadlock in the international system and collapse of American leadership. What do you mean by that?
It's often pointed to as an example of this phenomenon of a deadlock between the great powers. I don't actually see it quite that way. I try to point out that in many other crises, the great powers are cooperating with each other. The real problem, it seems to me, in Syria is that from the very earliest phase, the United States did not want to take an active role in trying to shape the contours of what was happening on the ground. It's what I call, the result is what I call the iron law of multilateralism. There can never be an effective solution that's multilateral unless the United States is playing a leading role, and that's where we've been in Syria. There's no real possibility here of better solutions while the United States is taking a fairly passive role.
And what makes it even more complicated is the fact that battle lines are shifting all the time. In Syria, government forces have the upper hand when it comes to military strength, organization and territory. Rebel fighters are poorly armed and divided, but remain defiant and determined, as Hashim Akhalbara reports.
Syrian rebels shelling army positions in the Kalamoun mountains. A crucial moment for the rebels. If they lose the area, they lose vital supply routes linking the suburbs of Damascus to Lebanon. In the north, the opposition controls large areas of land, but short of tactical weapons, they are unable to capture cities. Their only significant military gain so far is the capture of Raqqa province a year ago by groups affiliated to Al-Qaeda. Groups with religious agendas remain powerful in Syria, a major setback for Western and regional backers of the opposition. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars to create a moderate secular army to lead the fight against President Bashar al-Assad and control the country if the regime falls. But now, the Free Syrian Army is more divided than ever. Hundreds of its fighters were killed in fighting a group affiliated with Al-Qaeda called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. The opposition sacked the chief of the FSA, General Salim Idris, and ordered a revamp of the rebel army. Many groups rejected that decision and threatened to walk away from the Syrian National Coalition. Weak and divided, the rebels are on the defensive. Fighting seems to be shifting in Assad's favor. Over the last few months, the rebels lost many villages in the north, west, and in strongholds in the suburbs of Damascus. Opposition fighters insist that if they cannot get advanced weapons, then they won't be able to defeat a Syrian army backed by thousands of Hezbollah fighters and militias from Iran and Iraq. Hashim Al-Bara, Al Jazeera.
Elias Hanna, you did touch on it briefly a little earlier on, but tell me more about the increasingly compromised position that the opposition is in and the fact that it seems that they're losing control of the very important Kalamoun mountains. What sort of impact will that have on their fight?
I think that the Kalamoun corridor is highly important. It is the backyard of Damascus, the center of gravity, the political center of gravity of the regime. And it leads directly to Lebanon, where Hezbollah and the Lebanese army are really protecting this area from not letting these terrorist infiltration from and within from Syria to Lebanon and vice versa. So this area will create a safe place, like a buffer between Lebanon and Syria. And if you kick freely these rebels from this area, you will secure a long corridor that comes from Latakia into Dar'a. Moreover, I think that the urgency of this Kalamoun area today, or Yabrud, the urgency to finish it, comes really because I think that Saudi Arabia is changing its strategy by changing the leadership of the Free Syrian Army and moving the military operation from north, where you have a lot of infighting terrorist organization, to the south, where you have Jordan and the Americans that might help in the future. So this kind of urgency, I think that's why you are seeing a lot of military operation around Yabrud. So losing this corridor will really deny anything that comes from Lebanon and will separate the interior of Syria and the coastal area of Syria, and the regime will be more safe, and it will save more troops for more operation outside this area.
All right, Bruce Jones, you were nodding in agreement, particularly about the fact of Saudi Arabia getting involved and seeking to change some sort of command. What role do you see now between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Because, of course, they're playing an increasingly violent proxy war on Syria's soil.
It's very important, the changes that are happening. If you think about it in the following way, you've got essentially three sets of foreign-backed forces. You've got Iran and Russia backing the Assad regime and doing so in a fairly concerted and coordinated and credible way. You've got the radical for the al-Qaeda affiliated forces, and we've seen some tensions between them. And then, of course, you've got the various Western-backed and Gulf-backed opposition forces, and you've seen huge divisions, not just among the forces on the ground, but between the external backers. You're starting to see some change in that. There's an effort, despite the tensions between them, there's an effort by the Saudis and the Qataris to bring the various forces that they're supporting on the ground into a tighter alignment. You've seen more effective commanders put in place in the Syrian military coalition, and you're starting to see the emergence of a more credible moderate opposition in the form of the Syrian Revolutionary Front. So it seems to me that all of those, combined with what I'd suggested before, the possibility that the Ukrainian crisis removes from President Obama's mind the notion that he can produce a negotiated solution here with the Russians, we may start to see the emergence of a more unified, a more concerted Western front in terms of the backing of moderate rebel forces and moderate Islamic forces on the ground. And that could, over time, begin to shift the military dynamics. We've seen attacks on the al-Qaeda affiliated forces, JN and ISIS, and there are some signs of a change in the dynamics there.
Kenneth Roth, from the conversations that you have with politicians, from what you see on the ground, do you believe that a negotiated solution is possible?
Well, I think that the United States has made a big mistake by trying to come up with a grand negotiated solution. The Geneva II process, everybody wished it well, but it had no chance of success. And the problem was that during that period, John Kerry was treating the Russians as a partner in peace rather than an underwriter of mass murder. I think that is now over with. First of all, Geneva II pretty much collapsed on its own and made no progress. Second, because of Russia's conduct in Ukraine, it's not credible to look at Russia today as a constructive force. So now the issue comes out, what pressure can be put on Russia to pressure Assad to stop this war on Syrian civilians? John Kerry and the U.S. have been reluctant to do that so far, but that's changing. And indeed, if you start looking at the kinds of sanctions that suddenly are being discussed with respect to Russia's conduct in the Ukraine, those are the sorts of things that people have been clamoring for a long time to try to stop the arms flow from Moscow to Damascus. So
but you also wonder why, sorry, excuse me jumping in here, why Assad would go to the negotiating table. He's got a position of power now, and the same goes for the opposition, why they would go to the negotiation table with the lack of power that they have.
Well, at this point, I don't think anybody is prepared to reach a grand political solution. And realistically, the kinds of negotiations that should be going on right now are much more small scale. How do you open up the Turkish border to humanitarian assistance? How do you take away the sieges around various Syrian cities where so much suffering is being caused? How do you put pressure on Assad, even if he is going to continue fighting the rebel forces, not to fight the civilians who happen to be living there? Those are smaller scale, but would have enormous consequences for the Syrian people. And I think that by focusing on those doable propositions, maybe over the long term you set the stage for a political peace, but those are the things that should be the focus first.
Elias Hanna, you seem to be disagreeing with that.
I think that unless there is victors and vanquished in the Syrian cases, the civil war will be like a protracted civil war, and the consequences, the humanitarian consequences, will be huge on the Syrian as well on the surrounding countries. Now, I think so far the only solution for the Syrian crisis must be and should be an imposed solution a la Lebanese model, you know. And here comes the role of the United Nations Security Council, where you need Russia and you need the United States of America, and I don't see them cooperating in order to impose under the Chapter 7 the political solution. Why? Because you have the Iranian factor, and you have the Russian factor, and you have the Saudi factor. The problem is highly complicated on the Syrian level because the parameters, the variables are highly incompatible. I don't see a solution in the near future.
All right, I'm going to put this question to all three of you, and let me start off with you, Elias Hanna, because you finished there. How do you think this is all going to end? Will Assad be there, won't he? Will the country be divided?
I think that Syria will be without partition or changing of the borders, the internationally recognized borders, but internally Syria will be forever divided according to, you know, ethnic, religious, and sectarian forever. This is the model for the whole Arab world that we are seeing in Libya, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, as well as in Syria.
Bruce Jones?
I think there are two scenarios. Under one scenario, the United States takes a much more active role now in arming and equipping parts of the opposition, in coordinating and concentrating the support of Western-backed forces. And we see over time a change in the balance of power on the ground. The United States could take a further step and actually use direct military force to degrade Assad's capabilities in terms of his air force and his ability to use modern weaponry against civilian populations. The second scenario is that this goes on and goes on for a considerable period of time.
Kenneth Roth, your view?
Well, I think the most likely scenario is that we're looking at something like Bosnia or Lebanon. That is to say, the external territory, Syria as a whole, remains, but in fact there is a partition within the country with various de facto parties holding different territories. One of those parties would be the Assad regime. Now the question really is, how do you get there, or at least how do you get to a point where civilians are no longer being targeted? And I agree with the speaker from Beirut who said, you need an imposed solution, but Russia has no desire to impose any solution right now. They want total victory. So the key is, what pressure is the West willing to put on Russia to force it to impose some kind of humanitarian solution? And we're beginning to see the contours of that in the Western response to Ukraine, ironically. What this would involve would be, for example, banking sanctions against anybody who supplies arms to the Assad regime. Those are incredibly powerful. We've seen their effects in North Korea, in Iran. The US and Europe have been reluctant to use them, but suddenly that's changed because of Ukraine. We could use the International Criminal Court, which requires Security Council action. So if Russia is going to veto that, then we should be beginning to look to the General Assembly to establish a separate tribunal under principles of universal jurisdiction to begin to threaten Assad and others with arrest and prosecution, which is something that down the road they would worry about. So there are tools in the arsenal that have not been used yet, but I think because of the Russian behavior, suddenly are being contemplated.
Thank you all three of you for your vision there. Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, Elias Hanna, a retired Lebanese Army General, and Bruce Jones, Director of the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. Thank you so much. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria on air and online. I'm Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching. From me and all the team, goodbye for now.